Chapter 12. You're telling the wrong story about your life. The state of your life is a reflection of your state of mind. If you live a nightmare in your head, you'll live a nightmare in the world outside your head. And the surest way to create that nightmare is to tell the wrong story about your life. In jail, everyone had their own story. They all gave their reasons for what happened to them and why. A lot of the men inside faced up to the consequences of their actions. They knew it was them and only them who were responsible for the fact that they'd lost their freedom, and they were determined to not make the same mistakes again. There was another kind of man there too. I was part of a veteran community that helped men who'd been in the military with their reading and writing. We'd meet once a week in a nondescript room in one corner of the prison. At the beginning of each session, we'd sit in a circle on uncomfortable plastic chairs and have a brief chat. Some of this was just conversations about their progress. But all of us, helpers as well as those being helped, would also talk about how our lives were going, checking in on each other to see how we all were. Very often, the conversation would circle back on our experiences in combat and the impact on us and our well-being of the things we'd seen and done. We talk about our violence and aggression and the importance of cutting both those things out of our lives. There was one guy, Gary, who was a bit out of kilter with the rest of us. Where everyone else was looking to move forwards in some way, he seemed determined to stay exactly where he was. My PTSD keeps kicking in, Gary told us. No matter where I'm at or what I'm doing, it's always there. I'm not in control of my life. My fucking PTSD is. A sympathetic silence followed his statement. We all had comrades who'd been altered forever by the fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. I spoke up and asked Gary what the trigger was for his PTSD and where it originated. Macedonia, he said confidently, as if that explained everything. I think he believed that this would be enough for me. What he didn't know, of course, is that I'd been there too. While I tried to remember what I could of that deployment, he spoke again. Yeah, Task Force Harvest, Macedonia 2001. Oh, right, I said. I was struggling to think of anything at all that might have happened out there to leave him that traumatized over a decade later. It was a peacekeeping operation in a country that appeared to be on the brink of civil war. The army held checkpoints in rural areas, organised locations for rebels to hand their weapons in, and conducted patrols to discourage anybody who might have been thinking about starting a firefight. What happened out there? I asked Gary. Just seeing the carnage, the explosions. Right, I paused. But what specific thing triggered you? Well, he started to reply, now with a note of wariness in his voice. He was on his guard. There wasn't one specific thing, but, I've not been the same since I came back. It was time to show my hand. I was out there too, for the whole 6 months. There was complete silence in the room, yet you could feel a crackle of something almost like excitement. Everyone sitting in this circle was aware that the conversation was veering off into a very different direction. There weren't any explosions out there, I continued. I worked with the French Foreign Legion, who were responsible for all the mine clearing. None of them lost their lives. There was one Brit who died. He was in my squadron, as it happens. Saparian Collins. He was driving when a couple of kids threw some rocks off a bridge through his windscreen. All of Gary's assurance was gone now. Yeah, he started to say, before tailing off into silence. So it was the whole experience of seeing war? I asked. I didn't want to show him up any more than I already had. Even though I knew that his experience of war was limited to the sight of barren streets and sullen rebels handing over antiquated weapons to bored British troops. He probably spent most of his time in a camp doing nothing. Depressing, yes. Traumatic, no. I addressed the others. Was anybody else in Macedonia at the same time? The rest of the room shook their heads, as I expected. They were veterans from a different generation. Gary had found his excuse, his get-out card. He was as far from having PTSD as my dog was. There'd been no trauma in his life, and yet here he was, claiming that his mental health was the cause of all his problems. He didn't want to take responsibility for his life or the shitty turn it had taken, so he had conjured up a phantom he could blame instead. He wanted to be surrounded by vulnerable people. He was there for the belonging that the group gave him, and I'm not sure he was even that interested in improving his reading and writing. It wouldn't have surprised me if I discovered that he was in fact perfectly literate. At the end of the session, I waited until everybody else had filed out of the room before I pulled Gary to one side. You need to start being honest with yourself, I said. I was out in Macedonia. I know exactly the sort of tour it was. You need to go away and start being truthful because all these lies are holding you back. You've got a lot of soul searching to do, but once you change, you'll be free. It will be as if a weight has been lifted from your shoulders. But right now, you're walking blindly down a road that's leading nowhere. His mouth moved a couple of times, as if he was trying to shape some words, but no sound emerged. He knew he'd been caught in a lie. I didn't see much of him after that, so I don't have a neat end to this story. What I do know is that if he'd carried on pretending that he had PTSD, at some point he'd have actually started to believe he was afflicted by it. And what you believe, you become. You and you alone will have erected a wall that stops you from ever becoming the real you. You'll die not knowing who you are or what you're capable of. Your potential will all be wasted. Your capacity for self-development thrown away. You're going to end up a very fucking lonely person. Gary is typical of all of the most unhappy people I know. They're unwilling to tell the truth about themselves. Instead of accepting responsibility for the twists and turns their lives have taken, they're shot through with bitterness. Because it's easier for them to blame others. It means they don't have to ask themselves any uncomfortable questions or try to work out why they seem to make the same mistake over and over again. It's not that I don't feel sympathy, but fuck, it must absolutely suck to be them. The two stories. There are two stories you can tell about your life. There's the one with the negative script. In this version of your story, you're always playing the role of victim. People who see themselves as victims don't feel any sense of control over the world. This helps them explain away the things that make them uncomfortable. But people who don't feel responsibility for their lives are people who live in a prison of their own making. They're both inmate and jailer. Your focus will be on how much you've suffered, how unlucky you've been, and how many people have wronged you. Nothing is ever your fault. Your thoughts are full of phrases like, I'm owed, or I'm entitled to. Gary had a negative script for his life. That's why he was always fishing for excuses and telling himself that everyone else had it easier than him. But you can tell a more positive story too. In this telling, you're responsible for everything you do. You know that although you can't change the cards life has dealt you, you can choose how you play them. Everything is up to you. Which of these stories do you want to tell about your life? What reality do you want to live in? Positivity is the hardest thing to work on, but it's the most rewarding thing there is once you've figured it out. You'll trip up sometimes. Occasionally, you might slip back into your old ways of thinking. But if you're determined, you'll succeed. And after you've done so, your next job is maintaining that positivity, which is where surrounding yourself as much as you can with positive people comes in. The I can't fallacy. Lots of us tell stories about ourselves that aren't true. We say, "Oh, I'm not the sort of person who can do that," or, "Oh, I'm just naturally very good at this." It's very hard for us to shake these convictions. And these stories hold us back. They become self-fulfilling prophecies. If you're always telling yourself that you're no good at sticking to exercise plans, then what chance do you have of ever getting fit? If the story you tell yourself is that somehow you always sabotage relationships, why are you surprised that you're always unlucky in love? But there's nothing fixed about who we are or what we like. We all have an amazing capacity to grow and learn. So don't put limits on yourself by filling your head with negative myths. Instead of saying, "I can't" all the time, why not try to say, "I can"? The ant farm. If you zoomed up high enough above the world and looked down, you'd see an ant farm. There are days when I get petrified by the idea that I might be part of it. I know that there's always going to be a system, but I want to be as free from it as I can be. Others, by contrast, are petrified to leave the ant farm because they believe it gives them security. And, of course, there are those others that don't even realise that the ant farm exists. Of course, we all have those moments. It happens to me when I'm stuck in a traffic jam on the A12 and I imagine somebody looking down on us. How irrelevant am I? What difference do I make? If I disappeared right now, would anybody care? These thoughts can make me shiver. At such times, we lose our sense of wonder, of the unique connection we can form and the unique impact we have on others. We start saying things like, "I'm nobody. If I wasn't here on this planet, nobody would care. It wouldn't make any difference." But that is wrong. Oh my God, so wrong. We all serve a purpose. Nobody is nobody. Everyone is someone. You don't need to be Gandhi or Winston Churchill. You're someone to your wife. You're someone to your kids. You're someone to your friends. In fact, to the people who love you and rely on you. You're more important than anybody else. So don't devalue yourself. I fucking hate the nonsense about us just being these specks on the planet who are here for a visit. It makes us sound like ants. It trivializes our lives and makes everything we think, say, or do seem insignificant. And I hate the cliche about us being birds sitting on the branches of a tree almost as much. We're not visitors to that tree. We're part of it. We participate in life on Earth. We're not just spectators. What do you think happens after we die? Our bodies don't vanish into outer space. I always urge people to think how awed we are by the sight of a robot walking unsteadily across a flat surface. Think of all the technology and software that's needed to do just that. It's amazing, but it's nothing compared with what's taking place in our bodies every second of the day. If only people appreciated what an incredible bit of kit they're walking around in. We're all amazing, complex creatures who all have so much to give. If only we would allow ourselves the chance. But more than that, wherever your thoughts might lead you, you should never forget how much your existence means to so many people. What you do matters. You can make a difference. You should make a difference. The past isn't destiny. A lot of people use their past as an excuse. I'm not talking about that small but tragic percentage of people who suffered grievous trauma. I'm talking about the routine damage we all suffer. Those who see their past as a crutch blame it for their insecurities and failures. It explains their lack of motivation and discipline, their struggles with self-belief and self-awareness. Everything that's behind them ends up as bricks in the wall that stand between them and the best version of themselves. What we all must understand is that the past has happened. Whether it was good or bad, you can't alter it. That's one of the external facts of existence. What you can change is how you view it. And once you realise this, it can become an amazingly powerful tool. When I look back at my life now, I see all of the good and the bad things that have happened to me. Going to prison was a terrible failure, but it was also the catalyst for the changes that set me on the path to where I am now. The death of my father devastated me, but I also realised that it was in response to his loss that I started to build the resilience that has been so important in helping me survive everything that life has thrown at me in the years since. In fact, I now reckon that tragedy gave me an early advantage over everybody else. It forced me to self-reflect, to break down my emotions. I don't see those things as wounds or scars. They're just events or moments in time that have helped create the man I am today. When you acknowledge this, you're liberating yourself from your past and making sure that you can mould your future. Do you want to be a hero or a victim? That's your choice. Make it. Do you, a grown man or woman, want to be defined by things that happened to you decades ago? It might have been a terrible experience, but you've survived it. Thousands of days, millions of events have gone by and you're still standing. You must be doing something right. You've still got that will to live. The positive in you must therefore outweigh the negative. So why are you letting that one thing determine who you are and what you get out of life? You must be honest with yourself. You must take responsibility. And I know that's the harder route. It's far easier to blame whatever is happening now on something that's out of your control, instead of doing the work on yourself that's needed. You can tell yourself that it's not your fault. So, if that's what you want to do, then fine. Welcome to life on autopilot. But there is another way. Be honest. Take charge of yourself. Do the morning or soul searching or whatever it is you need to do. More often than not, you'll need to go through a process in order to progress. Don't try to rush it. But never forget that this effort will be repaid 1,000 times over. Exercise. Flip that feeling. The impact of what other people say to you is often determined by your own reaction to it. And I bet you've got a greater capacity to control this than you think. You can even turn negative encounters with other people into positive experiences. If somebody you interact with says something that upsets you, you could either plunge deep into the victim mentality and dwell on how cruel they were and how unfair your life is. Or you could see it as a chance to learn a bit more about yourself. Why do you think you reacted so badly? What is it about what they said that triggered you? By approaching the situation positively, you're already robbing it of its ability to upset you. Instead of getting red and screaming, you're just calmly analysing yourself. You're also learning something new about yourself that will help prevent you getting worked up about similar things in the future. Like so many things, you might need to try this a few times before it starts to work for you. But it's 100% worth giving a go. Lessons. Everybody has the ability to act as the author of their own story. It's up to you to use it. Your past is not your destiny. Start to live for the person you are now, not for the person you used to be. When you tell a positive story about your past, you're helping ensure that you'll have a positive future. If you tell a negative story about everything you've been through, then you're condemning yourself to a negative future. When you're lying to yourself, you're living a lie. And unless you can start seeing your personality and behaviour truthfully, you'll go on living that lie until one day you'll wake with a start and realise how much time you've wasted. But by that time, it will probably be too late. The idea that we're somehow insignificant or that we lead meaningless lives is the fucking ultimate fallacy. You are important to so many people. You make a difference. Never ever let anybody convince you otherwise. Chapter 13. You're too focused on the destination. I've never seen anybody as determined or headstrong as Melissa Wu, the Olympic diver I encountered on the most recent series of SAS Australia. When I first meet somebody, I avoid making any deep judgments about them, but I do try to have a go at making a back-of-the-envelope assessment of their strengths and weaknesses. At first glance with Melissa, I thought that she'd probably struggle with weight on her back. She was 5'0". But then when she actually started in on the course, her militant discipline and focus came to the fore. You could see immediately that the deep internal reserves of determination she'd been born with had been sharpened and intensified by the relentless focus, the hours of training, repeating the same action over and over again, demanded by her sport. It sometimes seemed as if she had a nuclear reactor inside her, driving her on. That mindset set her apart from the rest. She burned with a passion to succeed that none of the other contestants possessed. She committed fully to every task. Nothing fazed her. Then we came to the gas exercise, where the recruits had to go into a porta cabin that had been filled with CS gas. They were told that there was a hostage in there that had to be rescued at all costs. That hostage was carrying a valuable piece of information. It might have been a SIM card, a USB drive, or something they'd swallowed that could help prevent a disaster. I put her respirator on, then directed her towards the building. The idea was that the contestant goes in and gets stopped by the instructor who's already in there. The contestant then gets a chance to assess the situation. They can see the hostage chained up in one corner, and in the opposite corner, there's a table with a toolbox. They get 3 seconds to work out what they need to do, and then the instructor takes the recruit's respirator off and pushes them into the middle of the room. When it came to her turn, Melissa strode in, headed straight for the hostage and started fumbling with the chains, fruitlessly trying to undo them, like they were a knotted rope. Once she began to really cough and splutter, the instructor hurried her out into the fresh air, closing the door after her. I never grab contestants immediately after a task like this, as I always want to give them a couple of seconds to compose themselves. So I waited close by as she stumbled out. Watching her, I thought she'd probably fall to her knees and then cough up all the shit she'd been breathing in. Instead, she passed out and slammed face first into the ground. I turned her over, picked her up, and realised she was completely out of it. Her jaw had started to lock, and I was having to pull out the mud that had rushed into her mouth when she'd hit the deck. I knew instantly what had happened. A tiny percentage of people have a really unpleasant reaction to CS gas, but that didn't make it any less scary. When she breathed its particles in, it had closed her airway. I put her down on her back and carried on clearing the mud so that she could breathe freely. Flash, her eyes opened and she sat bolt upright. She was completely shocked. What happened? What the cameras didn't show were her desperate attempts to return. I've got to go again. There was only one answer to that. No, you really don't. But I seriously think that if I hadn't stopped her, she would have tried. She was still asking to go back even after the doctors were giving her oxygen. What we couldn't prevent her from doing was returning, still trailed by medical staff, to where the rest of the recruits had gathered. Her mentality was such that, if anything, what had happened had left her even more determined. We decided that the best thing to do was to let her continue, while keeping a discreet eye on her well-being. The next day involved a boat task. The recruits were assembled on the parade square, where they found 2 large ribs, reinforced inflatable boats filled with ice. We got them to carry the boats around the parade square as hoses were fired into their faces. After we'd been soaking them for about half an hour, I got them to empty the ice out of the boats and split them into 2 teams of 3. Right, lift it above your heads. Until you can hold it still, you're going to have to carry on. You could see the boats jumbling about above their heads as they struggled to keep them stable. In an ideal situation, the strongest person would be at the front of the boat, with the 2 weaker ones at the back. But this hadn't happened in Melissa's group. There were 2 people at the front of her boat, and she, poor thing, was by herself at the back. All of a sudden, the boat dropped on her. Thank God she's a supple, flexible athlete. It sent her sprawling to the ground, legs akimbo, head smashing into the dust. I leapt over to grab the boat and dragged her away. When I saw her holding her back, I instantly feared the worst. "Are you okay?" I asked her. "Yes, Staff." She shot back in a voice that was hoarse with pain. Getting her to pick the boat up again wasn't an option, but because I wanted to see how she was, I sent the group on a run around the parade square before ordering them to submerge themselves in the trough at its end. I could see that she was still holding her back. I asked her again, "Are you okay?" "Yes, Staff." I knew she wasn't, but I couldn't force her to admit how much discomfort she was in, even though it was obvious to everyone. Even though any other recruit would very likely have quit after the tear gas incident and would certainly have handed their armband in after the boat. I needed her to VW. I wanted her to VW. I'd never been in a similar position at any point in any of the hundreds of episodes I've been involved in. And yet, I knew that there was nothing that could make her stop. I knew how much getting through this course meant to her. I also knew that there was nothing here that would justify her sustaining serious and potentially permanent injury, or even worse. Of course, next morning, there she was on the parade square. When I asked them if they were ready to go, her "yes, Staff" seemed to me louder and stronger than anybody else's. Here we fucking go, I thought. Any hopes I'd had of her changing her mind overnight well and truly dashed by this tiny Australian Terminator. Some things are worth suffering for. A TV show really bloody isn't. A moment will always come when you realise that enough is enough. You've already extracted everything you need out of that experience. Whatever's left in it simply isn't worth whatever pain or effort is needed to secure it. That time had arrived for Melissa, but she was so focused on getting to the end that she either didn't notice or had forced that thought out of her head. That's why, in the end, I had to make the decision for her. She had powered on, God knows how, to the penultimate day. She'd already reached the stage where, as far as I was concerned, it didn't matter whether she actually passed or not. Just getting there demonstrated how phenomenally strong she was, both in body and mind. Melissa had nothing left to prove. Nothing. Her last task in the show was a 3-kilometre run through a mangrove swamp attached by a rope to the 4 other remaining recruits. The premise was that they were carrying mission-sensitive equipment that was more important than any individual member of the team. The contestants were all clicked onto the rope at 1 metre intervals. If at any point any of them started slowing down the others, then it was either up to them to cut themselves away or their teammates to make the decision for them. But I wanted them all to recognise when they had become a burden, to be able to overcome their pride for the sake of the mission. It was unforgiving terrain. The waterlogged areas were a slog to wade through. They sucked at your feet, and every splashy step was an energy-sapping ordeal. The dry areas were even more of a threat. They were all covered in sharp overgrowths of mangrove that stuck up in the air like forks. Anyone unlucky enough to trip up and fall onto them would be in a world of pain. I started off by really pushing the remaining recruits. It didn't take long for Melissa to stumble. For a couple of seconds, she was dragged along by the others before she was able to scramble to her feet and carry on. As we entered the deepest part of the swamp, she hit the deck again, but missed being bayoneted by the vicious mangrove spikes. Right, I thought to myself, this is her second lucky escape. I can't bank on her getting the same roll of the dice next time. We were 20 minutes in now, with at least another 25 minutes to go of battling through brutal terrain. And she was a stumbling mass of pain and exhaustion. It was her determination alone that was keeping her going. She fell again, and although she got back to her feet, she was clearly being dragged by the others. She wasn't in a headspace to see it, but she was now a burden to the rest of her team and a danger to herself. What they never show on the television was that I was running right next to her. I was just saying to myself again and again, she's going to go, she's going to go. I had horrible visions of a mangrove stump spearing into her eye. I could see she was close to passing out. As carefully as I could, I unclipped her and pushed her off to one side. You've been amazing, I told her, but you're done. Whatever you're doing, you need to know that you're getting something valuable and progressive from it. If all you're getting out of the experience is pride, then that's not a good enough reason to be throwing your energy into it. If what you're doing is hurting you, and you don't stand to gain anything tangible from it other than being able to say you've won, then ask yourself, is this worth it? It's important to know when to move on. Sometimes enough is enough, and it's better to cut your losses and shift your energy in another direction. Pride isn't a good enough reason for pain. Bonnie Anderson understood that. She knew that she'd gained so much already that she didn't need to go on a single step further. She understood that the journey is always so much more important than the destination. In fact, she understood one of the most important lessons there is. The destination is irrelevant. Be a hero, not a martyr. For Melissa, failure simply wasn't an option. I suspect she would rather have been carried out bleeding to death than admit that her race was run. In some ways, that's an admirable perspective. But in others, it's dangerous and futile. There's a time and place for that attitude, the battlefield. There are times when success can be more damaging than failure. I stand for ambition and dedication and pushing yourself as far as you can possibly go. But I don't believe in victory at all costs. Be a hero, not a martyr. Occasionally, you need to count your lucky stars and remember that your limitations are there to protect you from yourself. When people think of Melissa on that show, they don't remember the way she came unclipped from the rope. They think of the ferocious resilience that enabled her to push on after suffering accidents that would have stopped almost anyone else in their tracks. But if she stayed on that rope and suffered a nasty injury or caused the others to fail their task, then that's the image that would have lingered in viewers' minds. That's what she'd take away from it too. Being in control of your own story means knowing when to bring a particular chapter to an end. If you push yourself until you break, then you're more likely to come away from an experience believing that you're weaker than if you'd let go when you understood the time was right. A moment's pride or stubbornness can end up undoing a lifetime's good work. You will have given your story a nasty twist it doesn't deserve. A waste of time. It's dangerous to be fixated on the destination at the expense of the journey, to place too much emphasis on a successful outcome. What if you fail? The world is a strange and unpredictable place. Our best plans get derailed by events that smash into us when we're least expecting them. Hard work isn't always rewarded. We can't control how others will respond to what we do. Let's say your goal is to achieve promotion, but despite all your best efforts, putting in extra hours, going on training courses, volunteering to take on extra responsibilities, your boss overlooks you. If you've lived the last 6 months thinking only about that magic day when you're promoted to assistant manager, then this will come as a crushing blow. You'll feel empty and angry, as if you've wasted time and effort. It will strangle your motivation because you've lost your self-belief. Whatever positivity you once had will have ebbed away, to be replaced by one uncomfortable question. What's the point? What someone like that won't be able to see is that over the course of those 6 months, they've learned new skills and they've pushed themselves to do things they wouldn't have previously considered. Whatever they do next, they're in a far stronger position than they were when they started out. But there's something more important too. The city over the hill. Too many of us spend our days waiting desperately for the future to come. We tell ourselves that we'd be happy when we finally get that pay rise or that finding a partner will solve all the problems we currently have. Everything will then be brilliant, we say. And until that time, we make our peace with the idea of just existing. It's as if we're currently in a waiting room in which we have to sit patiently until our real life starts. But now is our real life. The days we now pass through are all we have. So why not actually live in them? Why not make the most of every single one? Why not treat them as if they were important in their own right, not just rungs on a ladder? Look around you. Take in everything you see. Enjoy the journey. If you're that person learning new skills because you want to make the next step up at work, then remember to take pleasure in the sensation of being able to do something you couldn't do before. Celebrate the way in which your confidence is growing. If you're doing stuff that breaks you out of your comfort zone, take a moment to appreciate how extraordinary that this is you doing this, something that months, perhaps even weeks ago, you didn't realise you could do. All you've got in life is the journey. You don't know what's going to happen in the future. You can do nothing to change the past. So you shouldn't worry about them. Commit to now. Commit to what's right in front of you this minute. That's all that really exists. It's all that really matters. Lessons. A victory won at all costs is not really a victory at all. Nobody gets a prize for pushing themselves until they break because they're too proud to walk away. The important thing isn't always crossing the finish line. It's getting what you need out of any given experience. Make sure that you don't get so focused on the destination that you forget about all the worthwhile lessons and experiences you've gathered along the way. You can't afford to spend your life waiting for that bright future that lies just around the corner. You must learn to be present in the moment, to focus on what lies before your eyes right now. Because if you don't, you'll barely be living at all. Chapter 14. Chapter 14. You struggle to motivate yourself. There isn't a single person on this planet who hasn't at one time or another struggled to motivate themselves. That struggle is the villain behind a billion abandoned exercise regimes, an almost infinite number of business ideas that never quite got off the ground, and more unfinished university degrees than I care to count. Sometimes the reasons behind the lack of motivation are clear. Perhaps you're in a job that doesn't challenge you, or you're putting off doing your tax return. It's difficult to get excited about unpleasant activities. At other times, your lethargy is harder to explain. You're given the chance to do something that really interests you, that you know you should be throwing yourself into, yet you keep putting off starting on it or continually find yourself distracted. Either way, I hope that this chapter will help you find the energy needed to get up off your couch and start making steps towards becoming a better you. Find your passion. If you're struggling for motivation, then perhaps it's because you haven't yet found the subject that really interests you. Find something that fills your mind with excitement, that grabs hold of you and won't let go. When you've found something you're passionate about, then you're far more likely to be willing to put in the work that will help you improve. The more stimulating and enjoyable something is, the happier you'll be to work hard at it. After a while, it might not even seem like work. And the more you put into something, the greater its rewards will be. You don't need to become the best in the world at that thing. Just work out what success on your own terms might mean. But you do need to be passionate about it. Otherwise, you're going to really struggle. Successful business people don't get up at 5 a.m. every morning because they feel tepid about what they do. The best tennis players aren't out there on the court practicing their serve action until their whole body aches because they've got a passing interest in the sport. Look for something that consumes you. If you find your job tedious or recognise that it doesn't stretch you, and as a result you're struggling to motivate yourself, then maybe it's time to consider switching things up. Discipline makes motivation. All of the above is true, but I also understand that 99% of the time, motivation isn't something that descends upon you from the sky. You might be passionate about something. You might really want to put everything you have into it, but somehow you never seem to get started. You put off starting your training for the marathon you're desperate to complete until next week. You plan to wake up a couple of hours earlier than you usually would because you want to work on the business idea that excites you. But you sleep through your first alarm, then your second, and finally decide that maybe you'll just stay in your nice warm bed. You promise yourself that you'll leap into the day tomorrow, and yet come 7 a.m., you're smashing the snooze button again. Often, you're faced with something you find boring or unpleasant, but that for one reason or another, you just have to do it. When you were a kid, that was probably homework. Now, it might be a challenging qualification that you need to obtain if you want to progress in your career. Whatever the reason, if you're trapped behind that wall, then you have to create your own motivation. If the passion you have feels as if it's dormant, but you still want to reach that goal, then you need something else to help you along. Here's an easy solution. Discipline. If you can be disciplined, then motivation will follow. That's what I told Chloe, who I spoke to after one of my tour events. She was a young mother with 2 kids, a job and a busy life. I liked her immediately. She had such a lovely, infectious energy. But she also seemed pretty anguished about her failure to motivate herself. I want to lose weight, she told me, but I never seem to find the time to exercise. And when I do, I'm too tired. So I just end up sprawled out on the sofa yet again. The thing that really frustrated her, she said, was that she knew she was absolutely sincere about getting fit. The idea of it meant a great deal to her. And yet, she couldn't find a way of pairing up her passion with the motivation she needed to realise it. She seemed almost perplexed by the situation. It was like she was adding 2 and 2 together and getting 5. And that left her feeling angry with herself, which in turn made motivation even harder. I know from experience that it's possible to get accustomed to doing nothing. You get so used to it that suddenly doing anything feels ludicrously hard. That's where Chloe found herself. "What time do you take the kids to school?" I asked her. "Well, we leave the house at 8 o'clock. Then I go on to work. Then I pick them up, and when we get home, I go straight into doing dinner. That's the problem. There's not even a big enough opening for a short run, let alone going to the gym." "Okay," I said. "If you're saying, well, I'd love to make a go of it, but I haven't got time, then you're giving up in advance. If you want it enough, you'll make the time. You've got to be sufficiently disciplined to pick an hour in your day where you're going to give yourself time to exercise. If you want this as much as you say you do, then maybe you'll have to consider getting up that bit earlier. Get out of bed at 6 and go for a run. Even half an hour is something. But you have to do it. And you have to do it consistently. Not just when you feel like it or when the weather's nice. Don't give yourself excuses. Set your alarm for 5:45. Try to do it Monday, Wednesday and Friday for 4 weeks. That's all I'm asking of you. It doesn't matter if you hate it. Just keep going for 4 weeks. 12 sessions. A month of your life. Then let's talk again." 3 weeks later, Chloe called me. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon." "I know, but I feel so different. Every morning I wake up ready to attack the day." It's all about breaking old cycles and getting into a rhythm. To begin with, just try to implement your new regime for a handful of weeks. Don't look beyond that. People are too quick to commit to impossible goals. They write lists with things like, "I'm going to get up at 6:30 and go for a run every day." This, it goes without saying, is an absolutely catastrophic way to do things. It's too big and intimidating. It feels impossible because it is impossible. And because it's impossible, you fail. And when you fail, your motivation takes a big leap off a cliff. If, like Chloe, you can just carve a small amount of time out of your day, then very soon there will be a physical change. Then a psychological change. And that's followed by motivation. It wasn't just that she'd lost a bit of weight. In truth, she probably wasn't that much fitter than she was at the beginning of the new cycle. If anything, her muscles were probably aching. The rest of her body was probably screaming "fuck off" at her. But she felt good. Just showing herself that she could keep to that schedule made her feel good about herself. I can do this. She realised that she was capable of more than she'd imagined, even a month ago. Cut distractions out. I had a similar sort of conversation with my friend Ed, who's also an author. He'd got a new contract to write about a subject he was really passionate about. This should have been a cause for excitement. But when I caught up with him a few weeks later, he seemed really low. He told me that his problem was that every morning he'd wake up full of motivation, rush down to his desk and turn his computer on. But that's where his problems started. He'd look at the expanse of empty white on his screen, and the cursor that seemed to be flashing impatiently at him, and all the hours he had to somehow use productively until 5 p.m. And instantly, Phil panicked. He tried to get going, and yet time after time, his mind would wander, and the next thing he knew, he was pissing about surfing the web for 2 hours. Or he'd suddenly decide that it was really important to polish his shoes, or pump up his bike tyres, or make a big pot of soup. Anything except the thing he was supposed to be doing. Just like Chloe, he couldn't understand why he found it so hard to match the passion he had for what he did with the motivation he needed to actually do it. He'd reached the end of every day feeling tense and angry and full of self-loathing. The solution for Ed was similar to the one I suggested for Chloe, except his problem wasn't that he didn't have enough time. If anything, he had too much of it. In order to build his motivation, he needed to find discipline, and he also needed to work out how to make himself less vulnerable to distraction. Ed bought a program that allowed him to block the internet. Then he set it to work for 25 minutes. After that, he'd give himself a 5-minute break before turning the internet off for another 25 minutes. It all sounds really simple, but that small thing completely transformed his productivity. All he had to focus on was 25 minutes of work. Instead of feeling overwhelmed and constantly vulnerable to distraction, he had a disciplined structure. Instead of feeling frustrated and demoralized at his lack of progress, he was full of motivation. When he closed down his laptop in the evening, he could look back and feel proud of how much he'd accomplished. When we lack motivation, distractions can really prey on us. And, unfortunately, the modern world is absolutely brilliant at creating things that constantly undermine our ability to focus on what matters most to us. I helped Ed identify what it was that impaired his ability to concentrate and showed him how to break a big, amorphous task into smaller, more manageable chunks. If you're struggling like Ed, these are strategies you could employ too. You might want to consider your environment. Mess and noise limit our ability to focus. And even giving yourself small rewards, which could be anything from some food to a few minutes on Instagram, as an incentive to be more productive. The other thing I know can wreak havoc with your ability to focus on a task before you right this minute is the knowledge that there's other stuff in your life that's demanding your attention at the same time. That could be another job you've left unfinished, or maybe you've argued with your partner, and anger or annoyance is eating away at you. It's so important to do everything you can to square away any loose ends that have the potential to unsettle or derail you. That's why I never go away on a work trip distracted. If I've had a falling out with Emily, I make sure we've made up properly. If there's a wrangle over a contract, I'll make sure it's fixed. Because I know that there will always be a part of my mind that's elsewhere when I want to be 100% focused on my job. The time is now. You cannot wait until tomorrow, or next week, or next month, or next year. You cannot wait until your head feels right, or you're more full of energy, or they've stopped digging up the street outside. Postponing things is really just a way of saying you're never going to do it. It's a lie we tell ourselves because we're not quite ready to admit the truth. You have to make a commitment to start now. It's just one piece of effort, one decision, nothing more. Just fucking start. Exercise, the plan. A lot of people who approach me for tips to help with their motivation are like Chloe. They want to take more physical exercise, but really struggle to find a way of fitting it into their full lives. Somehow, between family, work, socialising and everything else, there's no time to go to the gym, the swimming pool or out on that run. All their best intentions go up and smoke. I say the same thing to all of them. You need to find a way of integrating physical activity into your routine. I actually plan in advance when I'm going to exercise, and then make sure I keep a suitable amount of time free. In addition to that, I think about whether I need to go anywhere special to do it, and also whether I need any equipment. That's all pretty easy. The important thing is that you do the same thing at the same time every week, so that it becomes a habit. Think about what kind of exercise you'd like to do. Then try to answer the questions below. What do you want to do? When can you do it? Where can you do it? What do you need to do it? Lessons. The more passionate and interested you are in something, the easier you'll find it to motivate yourself. So, if you're struggling for motivation, perhaps it's time for a change of activity. If you hate running, then you're going to find it really tough to summon up the energy and enthusiasm needed for a marathon. You can, however, create your own motivation. Discipline is key here. You shouldn't ask too much of yourself, nor should you give yourself excuses. If you've committed to running 3 times a week, then you've got to run 3 times a week. If you can stick at it, the reward will come far sooner than you think. Distraction is the enemy to motivation. Try to identify everything that could get in your way or rob you of your focus. Whether it's a blinking light in your study or an unresolved problem in your personal life, and neutralize it.